Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this special webinar in which we will shortly be in conversation with George Eustice, previously Secretary of State at Defra, and who before that served as a minister at Defra both before Brexit and after. But before I introduce him, I'd just like to highlight a couple of events we have coming up, at which I hope you will join us to share experiences on what's been an eventful year for on-farm trials. So I'm just going to share my screen. So, as I say, we've got events coming up. First of all, there's Breeders' Day at the John Innes Centre, at the Dorothea de Winton Centre. Now, this is invitation-only event, so if you'd like to come to this, then please let us know, and we can secure you an invitation. There's also the cereals event, of course, and I hope you'll join us at the cereals event. We'll be there on both days. We're exhibiting, and we're also on the Seed to Shelf stand, the KWS sponsored Seed to Shelf stand, at which we will be talking precision breeding. And George Eustice will be joining the panel there as well. So we can get a preview of what he's going to be talking about today, obviously. There's also the Morley Innovation Day on the 19th of June, and BOFIN will be there. And there's the Western Arable Abbey Cereals Show at the Grain Store near Cheltenham in Gloucestershire on the 21st of June. And then finally, don't forget the Groundswell event, and we'll be exhibiting at Groundswell. We're also going to be in one or two of the seminar events at the show as well. So do join us there. And of course, we have, as you know, we have 4 government-funded projects in slugs, soil and root health, pulse crops, and precision breeding, which we're going to be talking about today. And we are recruiting farmers. And so come to these events, and it will be your opportunity to talk to us more about what's involved with being one of our farmer trialists who are paid to carry out farm trials within these events. So talking of precision bred crops, in many ways, this webinar is a precursor to the seminar at Cereals, and I'm delighted to introduce George Eustice. So George is a distinguished figure in UK politics and a dedicated champion of agriculture and the environment. He was appointed as the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs in 2020, having previously served as the Farming Minister since 2013. So George is probably best known as one of the key supporters of Brexit, but more importantly, oversaw some of the key policy changes that have shaped current government support for farming. As a farming minister, he managed the ban on neonicotinoids and implemented the ban on metaldehyde. He then played a pivotal role in shaping policies that supported farmers through the transition to post-Brexit agricultural frameworks, including the introduction of the Agriculture Bill and the Environmental Land Management Schemes. So 2 notable achievements during his time in office that we're going to look at in some detail are his roles in Defra's Farming Innovation Programme and the Genetic Technology Precision Breeding Act. So George returned to the backbenches in 2022 when Liz Truss became Prime Minister, and later criticised his own government's stand in trade deals, and in particular the 2021 Free Trade Agreement with Australia. Brought up in Cornwall, George was elected as inaugural MP for the newly formed Camborne and Redruth constituency in 2006, where his family farm at Trevaskis Fruit Farm, which is where he grew up. Since he stepped down as an MP in the 2024 election, George has continued to campaign for and represent agricultural and environmental interests and remains a prominent member of the local rural community. So, George, welcome to this BOFIN webinar.
No, it's a pleasure to be here.
Great, thanks. So can I start by asking you, could you just give a little insight into your background, the family farm, and what led you into politics?
Yes, I suppose it was an unusual route into politics in that I always intended to go into the family business. The family farm in Cornwall was a mixed farm of around 500 acres, but we did quite a lot of winter brassica veg, which is obviously a well-known industry in Cornwall, cauliflowers and so on. And also we quite a large soft fruit producer as well. And I'd studied horticulture at Writtle, and I worked in the family business for 10 years, and that was what I intended to do. But then in the middle of the 1990s, the business went through a difficult time financially. The very sharp rise in interest rates caused by membership of the exchange rate mechanism in the EU caused us some quite severe problems, and we had a run of very bad weather events, both mainly in the winter, which caused a lot of problems for us, and that led to a long-winded dispute with our bank and lender at the time. And once I came out the other end of that, and we managed to get a settlement, and we reorganized the business broadly in the way we wanted to. I basically became quite politicized. I'd seen things about the way the system worked that I thought were wrong. I'd seen the exchange rate mechanism be a disaster for this country, and that put me on a very strong trajectory towards being what was then called a Eurosceptic. And then my first campaign was the anti-Euro campaign, and really one thing led to another, and that's how I got into politics.
I see. Yes. Now, of course, you started as farming minister in 2013. By the way, I'd just like to point out for all of our attendees that we are taking questions during this webinar. So if you'd like to, if you've got a question for George, then please put it into the question and answer area. If you have a look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A and a chat box. The chat box is really for chat during the webinar, but the Q&A is where we'll draw questions from. And so hopefully, I've got a few questions of my own, but hopefully we'll have time for some of those questions towards the end of this webinar. Yeah, so going back to your time, it was shortly after you were elected indeed, that you became farming minister in 2013, which I think was the same year that the EU brought in the restriction on the use of neonics, I understand. Now, and Defra didn't initially support that restriction. Could you just sort of talk us through, the events at the time?
Yes, Defra always had a very strong science and evidence-based approach to these things, and took the view that on difficult issues like pesticides, you had to consistently stick to the evidence. And the chief scientist at the time in Defra was somebody called Ian Boyd, and he'd looked at all of the evidence and actually concluded that there wasn't actually much evidence that there was a risk to bees from the evidence that was available. And that formed, therefore, the basis of Defra's position. Now, what happened at around that time, there were other bits of government, principally David Cameron and Number 10, who were a bit more nervous about the politics of this, because there was a head of steam and a campaign against neonicotinoids. And then in the subsequent couple of years, there were a number of large field trials done, some here in the UK, some in other European countries. And some of those trials suggested that there might be an impact on, I think it was on honeybees in particular, but not other pollinators. And so, and it wasn't a lethal impact, it just affected their bearings. And so on that basis, a slightly more cautious approach set in the years after. But initially, it was a very clear view of the chief scientific advisor that there wasn't evidence that this was a risk to bees. And I always felt a bit sorry for Owen Paterson, because he was rather caricatured as somebody who, didn't care and just wanted to use neonicotinoids, whatever. But to be fair, he was religiously following the evidence and the advice that had been given by the scientists.
I see. Yes. So I guess the Defra the stand from Defra actually changed. It wasn't necessarily one bit of overwhelming evidence that suggested neonics are dangerous to bees, but it was kind of a lot of sort of circumstantial evidence, and as you say, the politics played into it.
Yes, it did, and it became more difficult as time went on. So there were a number of large-scale field trials, as I said, and the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology ran those trials here in the UK. There were other trials, I think, in Sweden and in Germany. And I think I'm right in remembering that the trials in Sweden and Germany didn't show any particular impact on bees. And the ones that the CEH did in the UK, I think showed in 2 of the trials no impact, but showed some impact in 1. And it was on that basis that, therefore, with the precautionary principle, you know, the trend on neonics started to move in that direction. There was some debate about whether it was a weather event in, you know, one trial site that might have had the impact on the pollinators. And it's the great difficulty with these unknown areas. You know, you can do the best you can with field trials, but it's very hard to, you know, eliminate all outside factors. But it was
Yeah.
on that basis that that we then moved towards a ban. The more controversial thing politically was removing the use of neonicotinoids on sugar beet and other non-flowering crops,
Yes.
because obviously if you don't have a flowering crop, it's no risk to pollinators. And this was understood by every country in the EU, but there was a lot of political pressure to ban them. The UK was the last country saying this doesn't make sense. We should just enable them to be used on sugar beet still. But actually, at that point, you were outvoted, and then it became pointless to stand in the way of it. And so the ban on sugar beet intellectually made far less sense. There were arguments around, you know, persistence in the soil and so on, which have continued to this day, and there's some legitimacy in those arguments, but it's not a particularly strong argument. Um, but I think removing them from oilseed rape was probably the right thing to do with hindsight, and I think the evidence has got stronger in that. I think the evidence that it should have been done in sugar beet is much weaker.
Yeah. No, well, I mean, one of the another sort of big blow, I suppose, in the pesticide armory was the removal of metaldehyde for control of slugs, and that was introduced in October 2020. So, I mean, you know, farmers were always pursued stewardship guidelines that, you know, and we were, um, you know, very much engaged with Defra in following those guidelines and minimizing water contamination and so on. So, I mean, what actually went wrong there, George? I mean, did farmers not were they not doing something, or was there something else going on behind that?
No, it wasn't that. I think principally on you know, slugs. So metaldehyde was starting to be used quite widely on cereals, and I think
Yeah,
that was partly because days gone by they would have burnt the stubble, and that probably would have dealt with some of the impact of these sorts of things. But you know, progressively they were using these slug pellets more and more on quite a large, broad spectrum, broad acre approach. There were stewardship schemes in place, and I know for several years there was a lot of emphasis on that. But then the really big thing that changed it for metaldehyde is new evidence came through that showed it was lethal to birds.
right.
And although the common way to stop birds ingesting these things is to make them blue, because birds tend not to like eating blue things, what they had discovered is that because the metaldehyde is ingested by the slugs, and birds would sometimes eat the dead
Right.
slugs that had metaldehyde, it was having you know, a very severe toxic effect on birds, and that was the game changer. And then also at the same time, ferric phosphate was widely available, and I questioned it very closely, but it was seen to be as efficacious and probably not at risk of getting resistance because it's a physiological product. It just basically decimates the slug rather than it be. So it's very difficult for a slug to develop resistance to it. So the fact that we had a replacement and the fact that it was seen as lethal to birds meant that I felt it was the right thing to do to end metaldehyde, and I was the one who signed that decision off.
Yeah. No, well, I mean, I have to say, of course, the industry is not entirely reliant on ferric phosphate, and use probably far too much of it. We have got a project underway on slugs, looking for alternative strategies to control slugs that perhaps we'll touch on later. But moving away from pesticide removal, let's talk about Brexit, because you were a very important, you're a key part of the Brexit debate. So why did you feel that farming was in particular was better out of Europe than in?
Well, I think when I came into the department at Defra, I was what you call a committed renegotiator in that I felt we should stay in the European Union, but try and come out of some of the regulations and have a a slightly looser approach, but essentially be in the single market and still probably be in the common agricultural policy. But I then had several years as a minister going to Agri-Fish Council every single month because in food and fish they have many more of these. They're much more regular than in other sectors, and I had just a lot of experience of trying to get things done while being a member of the EU, and it just hardened my view actually that we would be better if we had the freedom to decide things ourselves. Because whatever the issue was, whatever kind of fund you wanted to operate or do, whenever you tried to discuss it, all that would happen is lots of lawyers would come in with lever arch files and explain to me that nothing could be done because of the EU. And then on top of that, the EU has basically a system of extortion, effectively, where they fine governments for alleged breaches of scheme rules, and that made Defra have to be very hard and unforgiving on farmers that might have made innocent errors, because if Defra didn't do that to the farmer and sting them with 5% or 10% of their BPS payment for minor infractions, the EU would then fine the UK government. And Defra, as it was, used to be fined routinely about £100 million per year, all of it for completely trivial reasons, no real breaches of anything, in fact. And I just felt that was wrong, that they were just effectively using the scheme of the disallowance scheme, as it was called, effectively as a means of extortion. And I just felt that the Common Agricultural Policy wasn't very flexible or creative, and that we just could do far better if we made our own rules.
Well, so I mean, the rest is history as far as Brexit is concerned. We're now in the agricultural transition, and I mean that must have been it was an enormous job to implement a new support structure for British agriculture. I mean, it hadn't been done for 50 years. Well, you could argue it hadn't been done in the UK since we came out of the war. So, can you paint us a picture of what it was like as farming minister? And then Secretary of State turning round, all those years of the CAP into the agricultural transition.
Yeah, well, it was very liberating, liberating, but also quite daunting at one level, which I'll come on to. But I think for a department like Defra, that had really had half a century of implementing orders from Brussels and making sure that we find farmers the correct amount and so on, it was quite liberating for them not to have the restrictions of an EU policy, and to be able to say to them, no one's going to dictate to you what should be done. It's for us to decide. And quite quickly, actually, officials in Defra really took to that, and they liked the freedom to be able to think creatively. I'd
Mm.
also done quite a bit of thinking before, so I always felt that the concept of subsidies for land ownership or tenure, were wrong. They made less sense actually than production subsidies. I think if you were going to rewind and reform the Common Agricultural Policy sensibly, you wouldn't have ditched production subsidies and just switched it into a subsidy for owning land. You would probably have just gradually introduced more conditionality and environmental factors on the production subsidy,
Yeah.
so that you wouldn't have such a revolution and endlessly be fretting about mapping and fields and so on. But you still would have had that trajectory to a more sustainable agriculture. And you could have gradually over time reweighted it to grants for investment in new technology and equipment and so on.
Yeah.
But they didn't do that. The economists were so obsessed with decoupling, as it was called, that they then did this rather madcap thing of subsidizing land ownership, which was just a different type of distortion. So I had a very strong view that land subsidies were a mistake, should never have been introduced in the first place, and should go. I also recognize that there's a lot of dependency on it. So we set in law a 7 or 8 year transition, so you'd phase them out gradually. And I was also clear that the new payments, where we would basically pay farmers for interventions that were good for the environment or help their productivity, that they would be more generous than what went before. So they wouldn't just be income foregone as the old EU schemes were, they would have a profit margin in them. So that if farmers embraced this and, for instance, had green cover crops and embraced IPM and reduced their fertilizer inputs and so on, if they embraced it that way, there would be a profit margin in the payment they got, not just cost recovery, which is what happened before. So there are a number of key principles that we put in place, and we also recognize that we wouldn't get it right overnight, that there would be things done for the best of intentions that would be quite complex to get right and wouldn't work as we'd hoped. So the other thing we built into it was that it should be quite iterative, and that if we tried something and it was clear 1 or 2 years in that it wasn't going to work, we should just quietly drop it and adapt our approach so that it would be quite an agile development. And the idea was that the policy would get stronger and stronger year after year, rather than be a 7-year program set in stone like the cap used to be.
Yeah, I mean, I remember the pilot trials, the test and trials, and farmers very much being brought along with that process, and also farmers being encouraged to join SFI when it opened for good. I mean, what are your feelings now, George, with the new government and the closure of the SFI scheme, the sudden closure of the SFI scheme has certainly, shocked the industry. I mean, is that how, if you were Secretary of State at the time, is that how you would have closed it? I mean, they claim that the money ran out and so on, and there were no caps on the money and things. What's your view on what's been going on recently?
Well, I think the first thing is to, to be fair to them. I always try to be fair because I'm out of politics now. I don't sort of have an axe to grind, as it were. I'd always said, and it was always part of the design, that you should be able to adapt the policy and it should be iterative and you should evolve it as it goes forward. And so if it turned out that there were certain interventions that weren't delivering results but were taking quite a lot of money, then I don't begrudge the ability to sort of tweak that and change it, because for all the reasons I said, you don't necessarily know these things till you try them. But the thing that alarms me most, I think, about what happened is I don't really believe that they ran out of money in this year, because the reductions in BPS were happening on such a extent that we always knew there would always be plenty of headroom in the budget to fund the new schemes. And I'd thought about this a lot at the beginning. But when you
Right.
look at the headroom and the new cash being released from BPS every year, it gave you plenty of money to be able to do the new program. And so I don't think they ran out of money this year. I think something else happened, and that is the Treasury weren't willing to honour 3-year or 5-year agreements, because they basically want to pull the rug in the next spending review. And so what happened wasn't that they'd run out of money this year, in my view. I know they've claimed that, but not really substantiated it with evidence. I think what happened is that the Treasury wanted the option to turn the screw on the budget in the next spending review, and therefore they weren't willing to do these 3 or 5-year agreements, which are implicit. And that's a shame, because I'd partly designed it to have 3 or 5-year agreements precisely to box in the Treasury. And what you really needed was a Defra to be able to lobby number 10 to shut the Treasury down on this in order to protect the budget. And that's what we used to do time and again when I was in Defra. But obviously it's a sign that the current Defra team don't have sufficient clout, perhaps, to get number 10 to come to their aid and to deal with the Treasury when they come up with these wrong-headed ideas.
Well, it's interesting that you say pull the rug from under it, and I mean, Steve Reed makes very bold claims about the amount of money that they've pledged to it being the most that they've ever pledged, which frankly is a lie in my view. But are you suggesting that in the next spending review, the Treasury will want to remove agricultural support altogether?
I don't think so. I think they'll have a smaller budget. And this is the problem, that we'd always envisaged that there would be a budget of around 3 billion going forward for the UK, and probably north of 2 billion of that would be spent in England. And if anything, that probably needed to increase with inflation, and in order to meet the targets that we'd set under the Environment Act. But you see, the problem that I always face is the Treasury were never particularly keen on the SFI anyway.
Yeah.
Their view always was, why don't you just regulate farmers and force them to do this for no cost. So the Treasury mindset would be more regulation rather than payments for embracing the right kind of agronomic approaches. Now, I resisted that very, very strongly because I always said if you try and go down a regulatory route, you end up with the sort of nonsense regulations that we have on things like farming rules for water, where it's, no dung heap shall be closer than 10 meters to a water course, or other such things. If you actually want to deliver for the environment, you need approaches that are tailored to the individual holding. And you can only really do that with grant schemes, so that you can, a bit like Lego bricks, you can build a scheme that works for one holding, and it will be different types of interventions for different farms. And it's impossible to make it work with regulation alone. But the Treasury mindset is don't pay for anything, always just increase regulation.
Yeah, well, I think we'll probably agree that Treasury are not farmers' friends. But moving on, one of the things that I was really, really keen to discuss with you, George, was the Defra's Farming Innovation Program. So 270 million over 8 years, designed to get R&D implemented on farm. So, and I know that you were very much involved in setting that up and bringing it in as part of the agricultural transition. So just talk us through, some of the background to this, and in particular, what you wanted this support package to achieve.
Yes, well, it's partly going back to the first principles of the bill. As I said, we wanted to get away from subsidies for owning land, but then give farmers a profit margin for the things they did for the environment. And then linked to that, there was another piece, and that was we wanted to improve the profitability of farming, not by just plugging it with a subsidy payment, but by helping farmers reduce their costs and improve their profitability. Now, part of that was to do with the market. So we had powers of intervention to regulate for contracts with large dairy processors, for instance, to try and make it easier for farmers to get a fair price for what they produce. And the second piece was the generous grants to try and help farmers invest in equipment that would reduce their costs and improve their profitability. So that was the thinking behind these schemes. There had previously, as people remember, in the EU scheme, there had been a farming technology grant of some sort, but I think it was quite limited. So we wanted it to be a larger fund and probably a bit less restrictive. So that's what we had with the equipment and technology fund that was eventually launched. And then we had another idea, which I initially called R&D syndicates. I had this notion that, particularly in the fresh produce sector, where you've got large, well-organized businesses, you might get a large group of carrot growers come together to address a particular technical challenge that was common to all of them. They could put some money on the table and then qualify for grant funding from the government as well in order to be able to tackle that challenge. And so you would really foster farm-led innovation. And the great concern I had is that in the past, when it came to science and innovation, all too often money just gets given to universities and academics who are very good at writing bids, by the way, and they qualify for and get lots and lots of money, but often, to be blunt, don't have a great deal to show for it at the end, and then often bemoan the fact that there's no knowledge transfer to farms. So what I wanted to do was to turn it around and say, let's get some hard-headed agronomists at companies like G's to really lead on this, decide what's needed, and then commission universities to do the research they want, rather than for them to be stakeholders on university-led research. And that was the idea, was to get a much sharper, more commercial focus on the way we spend R&D money. Now that raised all sorts of I think objections with certain quarters, because they got in a tiz about pre-competitive research and competitive research and where the dividing line was. But what we ended up with in the end was the ADOPT program. That was about accelerating, the transfer of technologies, and was a farmer-led program.
Well, I mean, the ADOPT program, I mean, because we were involved, BOFIN were involved as part of the Farmer-Led Innovation Network with ADOPT right from the start. And I remember, God, years ago, having discussions about it. It's taken a very, very long time to come forward. But before we move on to that, I mean, there was the main part of the Farming Innovation Program does involve farmers. But as you highlighted, it was only really the largest farmers like G's who could get involved. I mean, was that, and it has to be said, any farmers who have tried to get involved with the Farming Innovation Programme, it's incredibly difficult because of the way Innovate work and operate. Is that how you envisaged it? Did you want more farmer involvement through the core part of the program?
Yes, I did. I wanted it to be farmer led, but I know, but often with these things, you do need one or two anchor businesses that they do it. I mean, I'm involved in a project called Trip, which is all about low inputs on potatoes, and Dyson are the sort of anchor business in that, and then there's a range of academics that are brought in and some smaller businesses that I'm involved with as well. So I think sometimes having those a big company as an anchor can be helpful, but you do want to make sure that it's accessible to smaller players as well and that they can play their part.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's what we've aimed to do through BOFIN, that farmers can get involved in the trials as contractors, don't have to bother with Innovate. We deal with all of that. And that's kind of the way Adopt has been set up. I mean, I have to say, when they first introduced the Adopt scheme, then we were absolutely bowled over, not just BOFIN, but other members of Flynn, in terms of, this is exactly what we were looking for. I mean, Adopt has now been rolled out. I'm sure you've seen the details of it. I don't need to go into too much detail at the moment. But is it as you envisaged, the Adopt scheme?
Yes, no, I think it is, broadly speaking. As I said, the bit that I haven't seen as much of yet is the R&D syndicates bit, because I actually would have liked to have funded research in a competitive space even. And I just encountered all sorts of resistance around competition law and everything else. And so it became quite difficult. But my view was, if a group of farmers decide to come together and breed a new variety of strawberry that is well beating and takes the industry to the next level, that's great for the economy. So why wouldn't we try and support that?
Mm.
And I think there would have been ways of dealing with the competition concern, but it became quite difficult to get that kind of support for what I would call, commercial end plant breeding. I don't really share the distinction that that's different to helping a farmer buy, a whizzy cattle crush that's a bit better than what he had before. I think basically, if it's what helps a business become more profitable and grow and be successful, we should just be a bit less obsessed with competition law.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I was going to come to precision breeding in a bit, but just before we move off it, comment on the amount of funding allocated, because as I said, it was supposed to be 270 million. Now, I'm no mathematician, but I've added it up, and I think they're way short of what they've allocated and what they're due to allocate by the time this program ends. Is that your impression as well?
Well, I haven't looked at the detailed figures, but it doesn't surprise me, because and often what happens with these things internally is ministers think they've made a decision that funding is going to be done in a certain way, and the Treasury come up with quite a lot of smoke and mirrors to say, oh well, it will in the end come right, but there's this funding period and that funding period, and there's an overlap, and there's
Mm,
the remaining tail of funding that was coming from the European Union. So you have to add that back in, and if you do that, it all adds up. But often, when you get to the end and you do add it all up, it doesn't actually add up to the figure that you said. And
mm,
I'm afraid it is a problem that we've always faced as a country, of the Treasury often acting like a rule unto themselves on these sorts of matters, and sometimes doing things that even number 10 haven't sanctioned, because they take it on themselves to do it. So it's always quite frustrating dealing with that sort of short-termism, with the department. And I get it, they've got to make the budgets balance. It's like the finance director in any company. They've always got to be the bearers of bad news and say we can't spend money on all of these things. I get that. But it's also just quite frustrating that there's a short-termism. It's always
mm.
it's always about trying to look for opportunities to cut and run, and abandon things rather than try to build things. And
Yeah.
we
But
need a slightly different culture, in my view, to make this work.
yeah,
I'm
I
hoping
mean,
that when they reopen, like the SFI and the others, that the funding will be there, and if they're allocating in a slightly different way, I won't begrudge them that. It's the government of the day. They've got to make these sorts of decisions, and I would accept that. But I fear that there's going to be an attempt by the Treasury to undermine the budget.
yeah, I mean, gosh, I mean, SFI is one thing, and we'll see what happens there. But my feeling is that cutting R&D is almost a lunatic move. But never mind. Let's move on to precision breeding, and let me take you back to 2018, which is when the Court of Justice for the European Union determined that gene editing was to be treated as genetic modification. And I was editor of Crop Production, a magazine at the time, and we had loads of farmers and scientists and industry, everyone across the industry, coming to us saying this is an absolute outrage. We should do something about it. We brought together a round table with Michael Gove at the time, and also Ian Boyd attended it, and it was great. But it put in front of both Michael and Ian Boyd the the feelings of the scientists at the time, as well as all of the industry. And I would hope that that played some part in, what then became the Precision Breeding Act. So my sense is that, for you and Michael Gove at least, this was the opportunity, as a self-confessed Eurosceptic, this was the opportunity for a piece of legislation that would notably diverge from the EU and could potentially play to Britain's strengths. So is that a fair appraisal?
Yes, so look, I was always very hostile to that judgment. I thought it was a bit earlier than 2018, but you're probably right if you looked at it. So, because the reality is, it wasn't a scientific assessment by the European Court. It was just a tedious legal assessment based on particular words that were used in particular EU directives and regulations. So it wasn't that anybody had said, we think as a matter of science, there's a risk in these, so they should be regulated as GM. It was that a bunch of lawyers in a court in Brussels
Yeah.
or Strasbourg or wherever had said, well, we think letter of the law means it's covered in the same way, and it didn't make any sense. And I can remember after that judgment going to the Agri Council in Europe, and the most striking thing is that even countries that were politically skeptical about GM, so particularly France and Germany, but also most of the others were unenthusiastic about GM. Every single one of them felt that we needed to retain a space for gene editing because they could see that without gene editing, if they closed the door on that as well, European agriculture really was going to go downhill and go downhill very, very quickly. So other member states also wanted the EU to do something in this space because the European Commission, moves like a snail. Obviously, it didn't act to sort out this legal problem. It just had lots of dossiers and pointless workshops that didn't go anywhere. And we had an opportunity coming out of the EU to say, right, let's just do it and decide how to do it. And it was very liberating. We just got the chief scientist in. We brought in a lot of other expertise, and we just designed what the model should look like. And we didn't have to argue with other countries. We basically just instructed Parliamentary Council in the government to draft the clauses, and we just got it done. And
Hmm.
it was a very early sign of what you could do with the agility of being a genuinely self-governing country, where you could just decide what was right, bring on the best expertise, and just do the right thing and do it quickly.
Yeah, but specifically, what are the opportunities for the UK here? I mean, I always talk about, the gene editing expertise that we've got in our scientific institutions is second to none. I'm not sure whether that's true, if I'm honest. I do think we've got some of the best farmers in this country, certainly, who can help shape these crops. But what's your view on this, George?
Yeah, I think it's first of all, it's a great opportunity for the UK to be certainly in within Europe the leader in these new technologies, biotechnologies like gene editing, because we can grant a license to do trials, field trials and research very, very quickly, and we can get a marketing authorization quite quickly as well. And once you get a marketing authorization for the UK, well, then you're in quite a strong position to be able to market the product elsewhere in other parts of the world. Obviously not the EU until they sort themselves out, and they'll probably get there eventually. But nevertheless, it's an opportunity to show some leadership. And the technology itself, I think, is absolutely critical to dealing with challenges like plant health and crop protection in the future, because as we lose more synthetic chemistry, we're going to have to be much more agile and quicker at breeding in stable traits that are resistant to certain diseases. And only gene editing enables us to do that. That sort of high speed targeted breeding capability to be able to keep adjusting varieties to be able to keep ahead of the disease. And I think it's very important for that. Can also be very important for drought resistant crops as we see the impacts of climate change. And it's just a technology that I think is going to be an important part of agriculture in the decades ahead.
Yeah, well, we've got the Probity project within that we're leading in BOFIN, which is going to bring the first 3 precision bred cereals onto commercial farms. In fact, just this autumn, we're going to start recruiting. Well, this summer, we're going to start recruiting for farmers to grow these crops. Now, I have to say, the crops that we're going to be planting this autumn are actually tilling varieties, which are an older form of precision breeding that isn't covered by the new regulation and is just treated as conventional. But they have quite exciting traits. And we've then got the actual PBOs, which hopefully will be coming through in the following year for 2027 harvest. But we are actively looking for farmers to take part, and we do expect to be introducing the first PBO cereal in spring 2026, which is really exciting. But obviously, one of the barriers, if you like, one of the hurdles that we've got to get over are the PBO regulations done by the FSA and ACRE. You've seen what's gone on with these regulations. We've got this 2-tier system in particular that the FSA is looking at it. What do you think? Is this proportionate regulation, do you think?
Yes, I think it is. And we've thought about this quite a lot. And the thing is that the intellectual case of those who said we should be a bit more cautious about this than we were was that you could breed in some traits that might have an impact on food safety. And you need to be, cognizant of that and have something equivalent to, what used to be the novel foods regime in the EU, just in case you're breeding in some sort of toxicity. And that's an absolutely valid point. And that potentially, there could be an impact of these on the environment, and releases. And so the idea of a 2-tier approach was that where the changes that had been made through gene editing techniques actually didn't raise any real concerns and had been assessed at a prima facie level to say it's pretty clear this isn't going to cause any harm either to the environment or to health. You'd have that first level screening by ACRE for the environment and FSA for health. And if it was clear it wouldn't be a problem, you would just fast stream it. And if it was a slightly more novel change that maybe raised the spectre of some other changes, you just needed as a regulator the option to sort of dwell on that a bit longer, require more information before you did it. It would still be a lighter touch regime than the gene editing regime, sorry, the GMO regime that we had in the EU. It'd be a lighter touch one than that, but you'd still need something just a bit more rigorous. And so I think that triage into a sort of light touch one for products that clearly have no issues, and a slightly more rigorous one for others that might be a bit more novel, actually is a sensible approach, a pragmatic approach to this challenge.
Yeah, well, I think my feeling is that you're right, George, that the regulations are, it'd be interesting to see how they play out. I don't think the first PBOs will be set for approval until November. it'll hopefully be ours that will be one of the first through the blocks, so to speak. So we'll see what happens.
All right. Well, good luck. Good luck. We shall see. You'll be the
No,
guinea pigs on the
no, no. Of course,
system.
one of the things
I
that's
mean,
happening.
obviously, a lot. Hopefully, it will survive the EU SPS
Well, I was
dynamic
just going to
alignment
come to
agreement.
that.
We shall see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What are your views on the reset deal that's going through at the moment? And of course, we still don't know a lot of the detail, but what's your gut feeling about this?
Um, I'm somebody who would be very, very supportive of youth mobility scheme, because in my own party, as well as disagreeing with, I was a big supporter of Brexit, but I disagreed with some of what my government did with the powers they had post-Brexit. And one of those was a carelessness on some of the trade deals, particularly Australia and New Zealand. Some of it was, I think, an over obsession with immigration and allowing sort of the wrong people with the wrong skills to come into this country. So, with a skills-based immigration policy, what the people in Whitehall say is, well, we need lawyers and we need solicitors and we need pen pushers like us, basically. Whereas what the economy actually needs is people who do hard graft, people who are going to slaughter chickens,
Hmm.
or people who are going to work in care homes and do some of those sort of difficult jobs that people in this country don't particularly want to do anymore. And so we've had, for several years now, an upside down immigration policy. So I supported the youth mobility bit. And that's a bit of a detour because the relevant bit's obviously the SPS agreement. And look, I think they conceded too much for a relatively modest gain on this front. And I know it's been a divisive issue, Brexit, and broadly people fall into two camps. There are those who think that trade is the be all and end all for economic growth, and they obsess about paperwork and how long it takes a lorry to clear customs and so on. And they're the ones that keep saying, well, we need to get rid of all this and just let the imports flood in. You then got people like me who say, actually, in the modern world, the success of your economy comes from technology and innovation and the way you deploy that innovation and your ability to have intelligent regulation that enables these new innovations to deliver the growth of the future. And that's where I sit. So I'm somebody who thinks trade is a sort of historic sort of 18th, 19th century thing that people obsess about too much. Yes, it helps, it improves your growth a bit. But in the modern world, the really pertinent bit is science and technology and innovation. And to be able to deliver that, you need the agility of being a self-governing country. So I personally wouldn't have done the SPS agreement. I would have said, carry on with the paperwork. But then
Mhm.
the government's obviously got a different view to me on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, in particular on gene editing and precision breeding. Now, the government has said that it's still very much supportive of the Precision Breeding Act. It wants to carry on, and there is apparently flexibility within the agreement for some divergence. And precision breeding is one of those apparently, but that's still subject to negotiation. Now, it has to be said, we are still some years before precision bred food arriving on the supermarket shelf, and any prospect of any precision bred food then going onto the continent from England. Surely it's all slightly immaterial at the moment. I would say that probably 2030 is about when these crops are actually going to come onto the market in any serious form. So I can't see that it's a huge threat on a to an SPS agreement. That you might have gene edited foods or precision bred foods coming through. So surely there
It's
should be
not
some
at all,
leeway in
no.
these negotiations.
Yes, exactly. So there is in the document, and I have to say it's a rather contrite clause, but it says words to the effect of it covers SPS and dynamic alignment covers everything,
Mm.
including specifically pesticides. So they've explicitly said
Yes.
that on pesticides in future we'll have to slavishly follow EU law, whether that's right or wrong. And then they said there might be a limited number of exceptions in other areas. And I think what Defra intend is that within that limited number of exceptions to make the case for gene editing and possibly other elements of biotechnology. I'm hoping maybe
Yeah.
biopesticides, because that's another area that I think is quite important. Um, and it's possible that they're going
Yeah.
to carve out some regulatory freedom there. But for someone like me, I think it's such a regression to go back to having to go cap in hand to the EU to ask for permission to make your own regulations to support science and technology when we just know way more about this, frankly, than the European Union does. You know, we've got some of the best science in the world and some of the best regulators in these spaces. So it is rather, I think, quite a regressive step to go back to being a rule taker in that sense. But we'll have to see how it goes. With a little bit of luck, Defra
Yeah,
will
well,
carve
let's
out successfully carve out a small area of freedom within this otherwise rather grim situation.
Yeah, well, let's focus on that, on biosolutions. And just before we do, so do bring your questions in, put your questions in the Q&A if you'd like to pose any questions to George. But biosolutions and biopesticides, and I know that you've got particular views on this. You put them forward in your talking point in Farmers Weekly recently. So, what are the shortcomings in current regulations over biosolutions then?
Well, I think the really big problem at the moment is we don't triage active ingredients or products at the right point. So what we should say is let's have an initial assessment of a product. What is its likely risk? And then triage according to the risk. But what we actually triage based on is does the product make a claim that's related to crop protection? And so you can have a product that's described as a biostimulant or a fertilizer, no problem. It can be used under quite a light touch regime. As soon as you say this growth stimulant has some impact on the plant and makes it healthier and better to resist certain diseases like potato blight, as soon as you make that claim, suddenly you're a pesticide. And you have to spend millions of pounds going through all
Mm,
sorts of assessments, even though it's the same product. So we don't at the moment under current legislation triage based on risk. We triage based on whether the label makes a crop protection claim. That's clearly bonkers because we've probably got some products that might be growth stimulants that maybe should have a little bit more oversight and recognition, and then some things that are currently deemed to be pesticides that have had to go through a very onerous system of authorization, which makes no sense. So my solution to this is that we should loosen the regime around biopesticides, have a green list of commonly used compounds in agriculture that are known to be safe, and then assess products against whether the main ingredients and compounds are on that green list. And if they are, give them a fast track to market. And then if a bit like with the gene editing approach, if it's a bit more complex and a bit more novel, and there are some potential concerns, we'll then put it through a slightly more rigorous process. But again, a slightly different process to the full works of a pesticide authorization. And I think this is so important because if we're going to lose synthetic chemistry, we're going to get increased resistance to pests and diseases from the small dwindling arsenal of products that are left. And it's just so important to get a new generation of biological products onto the market so that farmers have got a range of different solutions that they can lean on. And we've got to try
mm.
and do this quickly.
Well, it has to be said that, I mean, one of the things about these new biosolutions is that they don't perform like small molecule chemistry. When a new product comes onto the market in a small molecule chemistry, then they put it through all the trials the manufacturers have, and generally speaking, largely they perform as they do in the trials. That's not the same with biosolutions. They're entirely dependent on the environment, on the farming system that they come into, and a whole range of other factors that simply, haven't been tested before they come to the market. And that's why, at BOFIN, we very much support the farmer-led trial approach in those early days, as the, even before a product has come to market. But of course, you can't do that if you're regulating a biopesticide as a pesticide because it can't be used on a commercial farm, or there are severe restrictions in doing so. So we very much
Yes,
support.
exactly. And so,
Yeah.
yeah,
Sorry.
I mean, my view is that we need to understand that there's you can't just look at these things in isolated silos or boxes. We have to recognize that there's a continuum between good plant nutrition and then the biome of the soil and some of those
Mm,
beneficial relationships linked to the mycorrhizal effect and beneficial fungi and bacteria that are in the soil or on the plant, and that can help the plant's health. And then if you've got a healthier plant and you've got plant health, then it's better able to mount resistance against certain diseases and pathogens. And there's a continuum through that. You can't say, well, there's fertilizer in that box, growth stimulants in this one, and then there's crop protection. They're all interlinked, and that's why you need a slightly different system that triage is based on risk rather than triage is based on what's on the label.
do you think that's likely? I mean, going back to the EU reset deal, and you mentioned pesticides enclosed in this SPS agreement thing. Do you think that this approach is going to be likely? Are we going to be able to do that in the UK?
Well, I think it's become less likely because the one of the reasons that the National Action Plan was held up for so many years was partly because Defra struggled to get an agreement with other devolved administrations, and pesticides tends to be done by consensus, so that was one factor. But I know that the Windsor Agreement that was being negotiated by Rishi Sunak in relation to Northern Ireland, also just raised some complexities around the UK striking a different position on pesticides. And so I think this SPS agreement makes it much less likely that the UK will be able to adopt a more enlightened approach to pesticide regulation.
Hmm.
But what I'd hope we can do still is flex some of the existing provisions and flexibilities, even in the retained EU law. So, there's a sort of qualified presumption of safety for certain products. It's not used very often, it's quite limited, but it might be that we could speed up elements of the process even within the constraints of EU law. And certainly
Right.
that's what we'd have to do as a second best option if we're no longer allowed to make our own regulations.
Do you think there's opportunities for the UK then, in terms of, I mean, you indicated earlier that, we do have quite a good regulatory process in this country. CRD certainly, well, it certainly used to be world beating. I don't know whether it's is still to this day. But we do have the processes and the structure and everything, the regulatory approach that could take some of these new innovations and test them, trial them, and so on, and also almost sort of show the way for the rest of Europe, if you like. I don't know whether we're going to be allowed to do that, whether that's going to be anti-competitive or something like that.
No,
I mean, what are your feelings as far as that's
that
concerned?
was the grand vision that I had, such as it is, was that the UK would take advantage of its regulatory freedom to do sensible, intelligent, science-based, evidence-based things in this space,
Mm,
and become a hub for new technology. And that once we had shown how it could be done, the EU would be able to follow us without having to think about it. So on gene editing, it's very easy now for the EU just to follow the UK example because we've thought about it all, we've done it all, we've had the best scientists inform it, and they could now just copy that. But the problem is, if you make it basically unlawful for the UK to think on its own, which is what effectively is the inference of a deal on dynamic alignment, it does make it much harder for us to lead. And so I think it's going to be a really important test because I think there are a lot of businesses at the moment that are in that biotechnology sector that had been hoping the UK could become that global center of excellence in these technologies. But if they see that the
mm,
regulatory regime is not going to improve, I suspect a lot of them will actually just move to other markets like the United States,
yeah,
where they can actually just do it. And to be
yeah,
fair, you can't really begrudge them that because if there isn't going to be a viable regulatory regime in the UK and Europe, and the UK is not able to diverge from Europe, then a commercial business has to, in the end, do what's right for itself. And I think it's, if we don't get this right, I think it's quite likely that we'll see quite a lot of this sector migrating overseas, away from Europe altogether.
Well, let's hope that's not the case, George. And as you say, let's hope England at least can become a centre of technology excellence, and that farmers will lead this revolution, obviously. But look, that's just about all we've got time for. And apologies, we haven't really sort of come to any questions. But if you've got questions, then do let us know, and we can perhaps tackle some of those when we meet again at Cereals on the 11th and 12th of June. George, listen, a huge thank you for coming on and having this chat. I mean, it was fascinating for me, I have to say, getting a really good insight into the transition and all those other things that we've talked about. So thank you so much for coming on.
No, been a pleasure. And I look forward to seeing you at Cereals, along with hopefully a few of the others on the call.
Now, before we end this webinar, we do have a poll, which I hope will come up. If you'd like to rate this webinar, please, and let us know how you feel. Um, I'm hoping that a 5 is a high score. I think it is a high. Yeah, that's a good. Yeah, lots of 5s in there. Carry on voting. Wonderful. That's great.
I notice I can't vote for myself. There we go. So
Uh, and there we go. Fantastic. Thank you very much for that. There's a big thumbs up from everyone, it seems. Um, so that just remains for me to say. A reminder that we will shortly circulate a link to the video so that you can watch this again. And George will, of course, be appearing on the Seed to Shelf main stage in the Promise of Precision Breeding, sponsored by KWS. So that's at 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock on the 11th of June, and then 11 o'clock to 12 o'clock on the 12th of June. So we look forward to seeing you then, or at any time on the BOFIN stand, or at any of the other events that we'll be hosting or attending over the summer. And in the meantime, thank you very much, everybody, for attending this webinar, and goodbye.